When I asked William Peter Blatty, who wrote and directed Exorcist 3, where he got the inspiration for this scene, he told me that he'd taken it from this classic moment from Psycho. As Arbogast climbs the stairs, we're looking around to see where the threat will come from. And when it appears, it comes from an area to which he wasn't paying attention. Hear how the shrieking stabs of the music are echoed in Exorcist 3. Not just confined to the world we live in, jumps also work in dream sequences. Perhaps most memorably as the punchline of Carrie with the terrifying hand from the grave. Or the double jump in American Werewolf with its Nazi demons.
All right already.
Hello? Have you been up long?
I've just had a nightmare.
Not to worry, I've just the thing.
Holy shit.
But beyond the jump scares of those dream sequences, there's a technique which is even more terrifying. A scare so fleeting, you might almost miss it. The subliminal cut. For me, this dream sequence from The Exorcist is one of the greatest, strangest, and eeriest sequences of horror cinema. It uses a montage of disconnected images and a fleeting subliminal cut to put the fear of God into an audience. In the novel of The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty writes that Father Karras dreamed of his mother emerging from a subway kiosk across the street. He calls out to her, but she can't hear him. If we slow the sequence down, we see this, the face of Karras' mother obliterated for a single frame. Now keep watching. As Karras calls out and his mother cries out to him, we see this, the face of the demon. It appears so briefly amid a stroboscopic display of alternating black and white frames that we're not even sure we saw it. It's as if the face was lurking between the frames of the film itself. Subliminals have been used before in horror films, but nothing else has ever sent a shiver down its audience's spine as effectively as this short sequence from The Exorcist.
Thanks. It looks very inviting. Ouch.
Horror movies need their monsters, whether it's Dracula or Freddy Krueger, Henry the serial killer, a roaming demon, a stalking wraith, or a ravenous beast. And inspiration for these monsters can often come from real life. One actor who paved the way for many of the scariest monster incarnations to follow was Lon Chaney. He was known as the Man of 1,000 Faces because of his acting skills and because of transformations achieved via what has become a staple of horror movies, monstrous makeup. One of Chaney's most famous roles was that of the scarred composer in the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, a film still best known for Chaney's own makeup design revealed for the first time at the film's sensational premiere. During the scene where Christine pulls the mask away to reveal the Phantom's horrifying features, audiences were reported to have screamed and fainted, not unlike those at the first screenings of Psycho and The Exorcist. Chaney painted his eye sockets black to lend his face the impression of a skull. He pulled the tip of his nose up, pinning it in place with a wire, and further enlarged his nostrils with black paint. For the final touches, he added jagged false teeth, lending bite to the spectre of the Phantom. While Chaney may have done his own makeup, the job usually fell to specialists. Jack Pierce became something of a star in his own right, designing most of the iconic Universal monsters, from Frankenstein and the Bride to the Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney Jr. As makeup effects advanced, so artists like Rick Baker and Rob Bottin were able to create ever more impressive body transformations, mutating before our very eyes. Such transformations are a key element of horror, blurring the line between the human and the inhuman. Canadian director David Cronenberg pioneered the so-called body horror genre through movies like The Brood and Videodrome, in which metaphors about the human condition were given physical form. In Japanese director Shinya Tsukamoto's Tetsuo the Iron Man, metal and flesh are intertwined to eye-popping effect as the film slips into fantasia. But many of the most alarming monster effects sit on the cusp of the human and the inhuman. When Dick Smith transformed Linda Blair into the demonically possessed Reagan, he began by experimenting with witchy effects which sat very much in the tradition of Jack Pierce. But in the end, William Friedkin opted for something more organic, with Reagan's face mutated through gangrenous sores which appeared to have been self-inflicted. She may look monstrous, but it's her humanity that makes her terrifying. But what about the monsters that don't look monstrous, that look like us? When John McNaughton's Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer was released in the late 80s, it was advertised with the slogan, "He's not Freddy, he's not Jason, he's real." The writer Robert Bloch had a similar sense about the central character of his novel Psycho, inspired by news stories of the so-called Wisconsin ghoul Ed Gein. Gein was a killer and a grave robber whose crimes came to light when he was arrested in 1957, but what proved shocking was that Gein looked like a normal person. When Alfred Hitchcock cast Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates in his film of Psycho, he was looking for a lead who didn't look like a monster, thereby amplifying the surprise and the terror. Whereas in Bloch's novel Norman is a repulsive figure, Hitchcock chose the handsome, sensitive Perkins.
Well, the mattress is soft, and there's hangers in the closet, and stationery with Bates Motel printed on it in case you want to make your friends back home feel envious. And the, over there.
The bathroom.
Yeah.
But if I untie you, you'll try something.
No, I won't.
Since then, Ed Gein has gone on to inspire an entire canon of horror icons, ranging from the drooling necrophiliac Ezra Cobb in Deranged to the transformational Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Most famously, Gein inspired the cannibal family from Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, each member of which, Hooper said, represented a different aspect of Gein's fractured character. The most memorable of these is Leatherface, the murderous figure whose monstrously masked visage would become an icon of modern horror. Like so many figures in horror, from Chaney's Phantom to Edith Scobb's Christian in Eyes Without a Face to Michael Myers in Halloween, Leatherface hides his face behind a mask. And in Kaneto Shinto's 1964 Japanese horror Onibaba, one of the scariest films ever made, a samurai's mask becomes an emblem of demonic evil, which would inspire filmmakers in the West for decades to come. In many of these cases, it's the sheer blankness of these masks that makes them scary, the fact that we can't see or read the expressions beneath them.
I don't think it'll be too amusing for the youngsters if I conjured up a demon from hell for them.
So what about the face of that other recurrent horror icon, the clown? Well, clowns are meant to be funny, but in horror movies, as in real life, they have more of a tendency to be creepy. Fear of clowns even has a name, coulrophobia, and that's a fear into which movies have regularly tapped. Lon Chaney played a memorably miserable clown in the 1924 silent He Who Gets Slapped, a weird tragicomic drama. In Jacques Tourneur's Night of the Demon from 1957, Dana Andrews is threatened by Niall McGuinness's Dr. Bobo, a clown-faced children's entertainer who is also a satanic magician.
Hiya, Georgie. What a night.
All of which brings us to the grinning figure of Pennywise the Clown from It, the Stephen King novel which spawned a memorable 80s TV miniseries and a 21st century blockbuster which, in 2017, became one of the biggest grossing horror movies of all time.
Take it, Georgie.
An evil, shape-shifting entity, It preys on children's deepest fears by becoming the monsters of which they are most terrified. And what are kids most scared of? Clowns. Indeed, throughout the history of horror, we can find childhood entertainments and toys, particularly dolls and dummies, refashioned as figures of fear. Why do childhood toys feature so heavily in horror? Well, personally, I think it's because most of our primal fears are cemented when we are children. As kids, we dream of monsters under the bed and of sharing our bedroom with toys which have a secret life. Later on, we pack those toys away, but horror cinema can bring them back from that creepy attic into which we stashed them. And in doing so, it brings back the pure terror that we all experienced as children. Many horror movies work like that old children's game in which we're shown an apparently innocuous image and asked, what's wrong with this picture? Just as horror cinema can bring back childhood fears, it can also confront more grown-up anxieties which often have a political and social dimension. Horror movies frequently address the very specific concerns of the time in which they're made. This is especially apparent in the generation gap Vietnam-influenced horrors of the 1970s. Films like Wes Craven's notorious Last House on the Left, made in response to the obscene images of violence which poured onto US TV screens from battlefields abroad. Fast forward to the 21st century, and It Comes at Night seems like the perfect embodiment of America's descent into collective paranoia. A clever riff on the old-school home invasion movie, this is a vision of the near future in which there are no bad guys or bogeymen, just suspicion, isolation, and contagion. It's a terrifying portrait of a world which has lost track of objective fact, in which chaos and disinformation causes people to turn upon their neighbours, driven by the spectre of fake news. Sound familiar? And recently, we've started to see a spate of horror movies that explore the contemporary fear of the online world. A great example is Unfriended, which uses a simple but effective technique to tell its story. Just about the whole movie plays out on a computer screen. The format may not be unique, but this micro-budget hit makes the most of its self-imposed restrictions. Shot with screen-mounted GoPro cameras and brilliantly edited, this is the closest exploitation cinema has come to capturing the hive-like buzz of online life in all its invasive intimacy. And of course, the real horror here is our anti-heroes' inability to pull themselves away from their laptops. Despite repeatedly telling each other to just log off, they're compelled to stay online, to open links that can only work their destructive magic if empowered to do so.
Oh shit, okay, don't watch. Maybe it didn't mean anything. I love you. Stop watching, look at me, Mitch. Mitch, look at me.
Whatever your fears, when it comes to horror movies, you're going to need someone to help you, an expert. Who are you going to call? A savant.
Believe me, there is no other way. That victims consciously detest being dominated by vampirism, but are unable to relinquish the practice, similar to addiction to drugs. Ultimately, death results from loss of blood, but unlike normal death, no peace manifests itself, for they enter into the fearful state of the undead.
The savant is a stock horror character who knows the enemy, someone upon whom the hero or heroine may call in order to aid their battle against evil and who may well be sacrificed. These characters are usually older and wiser than the protagonist. They can also be weirder. Think of Zelda Rubinstein's spiritual medium in Poltergeist, a character who initially seems ridiculous.
Don't mind hanging back. You're jamming my frequencies.
But whose knowledge of the next world proves invaluable.
Where was the last incident of bilocation? I get my strongest feeling. The point of origin is in the child's closet upstairs. Yes, I believe that.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Can we get you anything, Elise?
Or what about Lynn Shay's paranormal investigator in Insidious? An incidental character who became so central she was the star of the sequels.
That's fine, gentlemen. I don't think bad wiring is the problem here.
And then there's Otto Jespersen's monster killer Hans in Troll Hunter, the 2010 Norwegian hit which found something inventive to do with the world-weary found footage mockumentary format. Each one of these characters holds an in-depth knowledge of the threat and the world it inhabits, which makes it possible not only to access but also to slay the monster. But for the savant, that's an understanding which can be as much of a burden as a gift. Peter Cushing may be a horror icon, but he was also one of the few horror stars who specialised in playing the classic savant, Van Helsing, rather than the title role of Dracula. Cushing played Van Helsing in 5 films, most famously in the Hammer classics Dracula from 1958 and Brides of Dracula in 1960. In many ways, Cushing became the archetypal savant, setting a template which would be followed by a string of respected British thespians moonlighting in horror, such as Donald Pleasance in Halloween.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
For the audience, these characters deliver crucial information about the monster, while also perhaps bringing a level of respectability to an otherwise disreputable genre. The savant figure can also become corrupted and monstrous, as unhinged as the evil they profess to fight. Think of Vincent Price as Matthew Hopkins in the supremely disturbing Witchfinder General.
You are all of you confessed idolaters. However, these proceedings shall be carried out through due process of law. What law demands, we shall satisfy. You will each be tied in a prescribed fashion and cast into the moat.
There's a touch of that derangement in Robert Shaw's performance in Steven Spielberg's monster shocker Jaws, in which he plays seasoned shark hunter and textbook twisted savant Quint. Quint is haunted by the spectre of hungry sharks, a spectre conjured up in the film's best-known monologue.
You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. When he comes at you, he doesn't seem to be living until he bites you, and those black eyes roll over white, and then... oh, then you hear that terrible high-pitched screaming.
Many horror films crank up the tension and excitement with a chase sequence in which the monster pursues its prey and us, the audience. Speed is often a key factor. In Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, our heroes are pursued by demons which lurk in the woods. With very limited resources, Raimi and his team fashioned a homemade Steadicam which they called the Shaky Cam. By mounting their camera on a plank of wood, they're able to get cheap but effective low-angle shots, giving the POV of evil forces rushing through the forest. Raimi took inspiration from the Steadicam shots in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which were themselves predated by the Panaglide opening of John Carpenter's Halloween. In each of these cases, we get to see the chase, or the stalk, from the point of view of the killer. But those chases don't have to be fast. In fact, they can be just the opposite. Zombie movies such as George Romero's Living Dead series have long played on the fear of the slow but relentless chase, a tide of evil moving inexorably towards us. Horror movies are full of slow-moving monsters and psychos who only catch up with their victims because they fall over or back themselves into a corner.
There's zombies everywhere.
Yeah, but they ain't spotted him yet.
Hamish! Wake up! Wake up, you silly old fucker!
This convention is so well established that it was parodied to hilarious effect in the British comedy horror Cockneys vs Zombies, in a low-speed chase between The Walking Dead and an OAP in a Zimmer frame.
Run! Why are you going so fast? Get off!
And in the recent horror movie It Follows, fear returns at a walking pace, slow but unstoppable.
Hello? Hello?
A peculiar feature of many horror films is the way they can jump between the points of view of the monster and their victim. This cross-identification is a slippery hallmark of horror, something you don't tend to find in other more formulaic genres. It tells us something very important about the way horror films confound our expectations, and it leads us to the figure of the final girl. It's often been assumed that horror movies have a misogynist edge,
Sandy?
that they represent a male gaze terrorizing women. But one of the most interesting things about horror is that viewers don't identify with the people you expect. In fact, as a lifelong horror fan, I've always felt that the genre wasn't sadistic but masochistic in an entirely healthy way. Think about it. If you watch a horror film and you find yourself being scared by a monster or a killer, then you're identifying not with the pursuer, but with the pursued. And it doesn't matter whether they are the same gender or race or age as you. What matters is that the movie allows you to share their perspective. To understand this, look no further than the recurrent figure of the final girl. That term was first coined by Carol J. Clover in her brilliant book Men, Women and Chainsaws. Clover noted that despite the genre's reputation for terrorizing women, the most enduring horror films return time and again to the figure of a female avenger who outwits and outlasts everyone else.
Please don't.
This shouldn't come as a surprise. One of the ur-texts of horror is Red Riding Hood, a story recently retold in the fantasy horror genre by Twilight director Catherine Hardwicke. The final girl is not only the last one left alive, but also the only one who can defeat the monster or evil. She's the woman who, by her innocence or faith or strength of character, prevails. We can find a forerunner of the final girl in the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, in which it's the heroine, rather than any of the men, who destroys the monster, although she has to sacrifice herself in the process. By the 1940s, Dorothy Maguire was triumphing over her assailant in The Spiral Staircase, one of the very first slasher movies. Since then, we've had a string of final girls such as Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, Heather Langenkamp in A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Sigourney Weaver in Alien, all of whom have outlived their enemy. Beyond the figure of the final girl, horror films are also full of powerful mothers who are stronger and sometimes more scary than any movie monsters. Look at Essie Davis in The Babadook. Here we have a character who's fighting monsters on several fronts. She plays a traumatised single mum who's haunted by memories of her husband's death in a car crash en route to the maternity ward. 6 years after the accident, her troubled young son Samuel is struggling with demons of his own, and it's suggested that the Babadook may be a projection of his mother's own anxieties.
The Babadook did it, Mum.
But it's still down to her to defeat the demon, and that's something she does through a mixture of strength, invention, and most importantly, love.
You're nothing!
You can see a similar twist on the final girl in Under the Shadow, Babak Amvri's brilliant Tehran set Frightener, in which an independently spirited woman finds herself torn between the demonic forces tormenting her daughter and the random rockets falling from the sky. While cinematographer Kit Fraser shoots early domestic scenes in neo-realist handheld style, the visual aesthetic becomes more angular and expressionist as Shade descends into a sleepwalking nightmare, replete with skin-crawling flashes of a wraith-like figure. A disorientating shot of Shade lying in a bed with the camera tilted at 90 degrees seems to provide a literal tipping point, a moment when waking life becomes a dream.
On with it.
I'm doing it. I can't go any faster.
Maternity is also central to one of the best horror movies of recent years, Alice Lowe's Prevenge.
I'm sorry, Ella, I've had to make some really harsh cuts.
A satirical shocker about an expectant mother who hears her unborn child telling her to embark on a vengeful killing spree.
Ruth, you missed your scan.
Don't want to know what's in there. I'm scared of her. I mean, I'm not even in control. It's like I'm some crap banged out car and she's driving. I'm just the vehicle. Honestly, it's like a hostile takeover.
He's coming. Do it. Do it now.
Most remarkably, Alice Lowe wrote and shot Prevenge whilst heavily pregnant, lending a uniquely personal edge to the film's powerfully female perspective. And like so many other women who've found their home in horror, Lowe uses the genre to talk about complex issues in a manner that's engaging, entertaining, and utterly surprising.
You're getting better at this.
Do you think so?
Oh, yes.
I do too.
There's a ritual element to all genres, especially the genre that most often features satanic or sacrificial rituals. Traditionally, you'd have a monster and then have it defeated by the crucifix, a stake through the heart, or men with torches or silver bullets. And Van Helsing gets a few words at the end to reassure us that everything is right now. Or at least that's how it was until the late 1960s, when less comforting endings became de rigueur.
Everything appears to be under control.
Look at George Romero's 1968 classic Night of the Living Dead, one of the most powerful and politically pointed horror movies of any generation. Dealing with themes of racism and civil unrest, Night of the Living Dead ends with a message that the monsters are actually less dangerous to the hero than the forces of normality. To an African American, a torch-wielding white posse poses more of a threat than the dead coming back to life.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes. Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
This kind of shock ending in which evil is not defeated quickly became a convention as rigid as the happy endings of earlier horror films. The trait soon mutated into the sequel hook, the prototype for which is the disappearance of Michael's body at the end of Halloween. By the time Wes Craven made A Nightmare on Elm Street in the 80s, he was adding a hook at the specific insistence of the studio so the film could found a franchise if it was a hit. Today, we've grown used to the idea that the monster will return if a sequel seems viable. Almost all the Friday the 13th movies end with Jason showing signs of returning.
Yeah? Are you still out there? I can't hear you.
And even though Carrie is in her grave, she can still reach the last surviving classmate in her dreams. It's hard to think of any other genre in which the unresolved open ending has become such a staple. As we noted at the beginning, horror movies will endure. Whenever anyone thinks they're dead and buried, they rise again from the grave. The horror novelist Clive Barker once told me that he thought there was something fundamentally reassuring about horror's capacity to keep coming back for more. As he said, OK, zombies may crash in through the French windows, but hey, at least there's life after death. But perhaps that's even worse. The idea that even the grave cannot stop the horror. As we learn in the 1931 Dracula, there are worse things awaiting man than death. Now that is scary. Sweet dreams.